In this last mini lecture in this particular chapter, we're going to talk about what are the advantages or benefits of object-oriented programming, what are the challenges to using object-oriented programming languages, and finally, some common applications of object-oriented programming languages. Let me just give you a little bit of information here. You're not going to be able to make complete sense of the benefits as well as drawbacks as well as applications until you have learned at least 2 to 3 programming languages. So you will only be able to appreciate the drawbacks, advantages and applications once you begin to work in real life in the industry. But still, just to give you a little idea, it is more of a memory test rather than an understanding test. The advantages of object oriented programming is it overcomes the disadvantages or drawbacks of structured programming or procedural programming by giving equal importance to data and code. Advantage of object oriented programming is you can easily model an entity in real world. Like for example, I gave you the example of painting, PUC automation, MBA automation, school automation and so on. By the use of inheritance, I am able to reuse code without having to develop an application from scratch. The features of data hiding ensures that I am able to protect my data from unauthorized access. Like when I'm checking my marks from PUC site, I just have to send the message. It just gives me the request for my marks without showing me the marks of other students. So security of data is ensured through abstraction data hiding. Now, by dividing the project into a number of classes or objects or using an object-oriented approach to development, I can create or break down my application into a number of object or classes, and I can give the development of each object to separate teams, and these objects can be developed in parallel to speed up the development of my project or faster development of my application. The advantage of object oriented programming is it can be applied from very simple small programs to huge projects which involve millions of lines of code. Software complexity can be managed easily because the object hides the implementation details and only exposes the behavior or the functionality. Very easy to transform the problems in real world, or it is easy to map objects from the problem domain to the implementation or program domain. By using the concept of passing messages, we are able to design very simple interfaces. Interfaces means of interacting with that particular software. Advantage of object oriented programming is higher quality software with less bugs, more reusability, faster development time, and lower cost of maintenance of software. But you must have already discovered by now there are too many terminologies to be learning and object oriented programming as your first language. Thereby, the learning tends to be a little steep because not only you need to learn the programming logic, you also need to understand the terminologies associated with object oriented programming like data hiding, polymorphism, inheritance, class, object, abstraction, and so on. So for a beginner, structured programming or the conventional C programming is much easier, whereas learning object-oriented programming directly, you require to understand a lot of new terminology, and thereby the learning is a little more challenging than the conventional way of learning. Now, object-oriented programming requires a lot of real-world experience. So you will require special skills in order to design an object-oriented application, code an object-oriented application, maintain and deploy and think in terms of object-oriented programming. Here, you cannot directly jump and code. When you're doing object-oriented programming, since you're doing a bottoms-up implementation, you need to have extremely good idea about the details about planning, design, implementation before you can go ahead and code. The programs, due to a number of objects, how they interact can be tricky to code and understand. Due to the interaction of different objects, program design or program interaction can be at times hard to understand. Now let's try to understand, or let's try to simply list out the applications where object oriented programming is used. Object oriented programming has been widely used in the development of your Windows operating system, in the development of your graphical user interface or GUI, as we took a look at in the earlier session. It is used in artificial intelligence application, expert systems, object oriented databases, computer aided design, computer aided manufacturing systems, and so on. Especially Java, if you see, is very heavily used. C++ is very heavily used. Python is very heavily used, and these all rely on concepts of object oriented programming. Now, this is used in simulation and modeling applications, modeling a bridge, simulating a bomb blast. These are all examples of use of object-oriented programming. Parallel programming, like I give you an example of adding the matrix elements parallelly. That is an application using object-oriented programming. Neural networks, for now, just don't even worry about it. Decision support systems, automating or developing code for your offices, hypertext and hypermedia applications are all that links and audio video you see on your web are either hypertext or hypermedia. They have all been developed using object oriented programming. So this, I believe, should give you a good understanding of what are the advantages, drawbacks, and common applications of object oriented programming. With this, we wind up this chapter. But just before I wind up finally, I just like to give you a little heads up. Do not panic or get worried if you do not understand anything or everything in this particular chapter. The reason being, this chapter will make complete sense once you have developed or learned object oriented programming in complete. Just try to memorize a few questions which are frequently asked, like what are the features of an object oriented programming language, what are the application, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages. That should be good enough. I usually never tell to memorize, but this is one of the rare exceptions where you are forced to memorize because the way the syllabus has chapter has been put in there.